All right, hello everybody. I am making this video to introduce the LEQ, the long essay question. We'll talk a little bit about what the LEQ is, but then also just how to write it. We've already talked a little bit about the test version. I'm just going to scroll down so that we can look at that again and what it looks like. The LEQ is the last question on the test, questions 2 through 4 of section 2 of the test. It's 15% of the overall grade. The LEQ is the closest thing to like an essay that you've written before. It is just a question I just put out there, and you are asked to come up with information to support what you know, to show what you know. There are 3 different topics that you can choose from. I mentioned in my introduction video about exam description, they'll be kind of the same thing. And when I say that, what I mean is like they'll be how did economy affect society in periods 1 through 3 and periods then 4 through 6, 7 through 9. They won't say that. They'll say like how did the economy affect society in the colonial periods from the years 1600 to 17 whatever. And then for the next ones, they'll say the same thing. How did they affect society in the early American Republic from 1800 to 1855 or whatever? And then they'll say, how did it affect society, the economy affect society in the 20th century from 1915 to, whatever. So I'm making all of these up. But the idea is that you'll have those choices and you'll pick one. And of course, you want to pick one that you have some evidence for. And you'll see in just a minute the things you have to have in these LEQs. And so you'll want to make sure that you can talk about that in a way that is going to get you points. That's what this is all about in the end, is getting those points for, again, this 15% of the test. So I'm going to go through some of these and some of the things that you're doing, and we're going to talk about how you should be focusing on this. Again, you have 40 minutes, but I'm going to tell you, and I'm showing you here how I think you should break down your time. I don't think that once you get better at these, because I think if you're taking this class, you're probably decent at writing, or you at least have done it before. I think as you have practiced this semester, I don't think you're going to need 40 minutes to do that, and you're going to want some more time for the DBQ. It's a different task altogether. And with the LEQ, you can't really fake it. And so by that, what I mean is if you don't know it in that moment, you don't know it. So you can write and do the best that you can to get the information on the page and get a few points, and then you can kind of move on. So I'm going to show you how to do that. But we'll talk about evidence as well. And so this will also be a good time to kind of explain how some of the things that I've asked you to do for this class comes into play for an assignment like this. So here's the LEQ. Without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and get into it. The steps for writing an LEQ. Step 1. This is my suggestion. So I should say that this is how I would do it. If I were writing an LEQ, I would do it in this order. And I suggest you try it and do it this way, and then you'll kind of figure out after you work on it, and you're going to do one right after this, and then you'll do one in the next period as well. You'll figure out whether or not it works for you and kind of how timing works and those kind of things. So I would suggest first reading the question, figuring out what it's asking. I know that sounds crazy, and honestly, when you see the question, you'll be like, it doesn't take 3 minutes to do that, but if you have a misunderstanding of what the question is when you answer it, you are in a load of trouble. Like you're kind of out of luck right out of the gate. So I highly recommend that you really take some time to figure out what it's asking. Annotate the question, think about what it wants to know from you, and then kind of get an idea of what you think your answer might be. Right. So I highly recommend taking some serious time to do that. And that's why I say 3 minutes to read it. Again, it's not a long question. And then for step 2, you should make a list of evidence. You want to pay attention to the dates in the prompt and sort it into potential subtopics. We're going to talk about how the scoring works for this. But the only way to get points for evidence is to use specific pieces of evidence that relate to the prompt from the years in it. So if it says from 1700 to 1775, and you mention the Declaration of Independence, even though that might support your answer, that's 1776. It doesn't count. It cannot count. There's no leeway there. There's a reason that they pick the years that they do. They have a whole purpose, and the readers are not going to give that to you. So you've got to make sure that you have that. And that's why I have you doing all of those key terms on all of those key concept assignments. It's a lot of them, but if you are learning those, and I told you to put them on flashcards, if you can drill those into your brain, then you're going to have these types of things. We're going to talk about what kind of evidence too, right? But you should read the question first and then immediately start thinking of evidence. Just write a list and try to get 10 things out or more if you can. You don't need that many. But then once you start thinking about it, you know where to put them. So, again, we'll look at that in just a second. For step 3, you're going to write a thesis that makes a clear claim, identifies subtopics, and sets up your argument. This is going to be a big part of it as well. You'll see it's the first thing on every rubric is your thesis. This is your argument. What you have to say, and I'll give you some tips on argument and thesis here in just a second. And I take some time on that as well. You're just writing one sentence, but you want to take about 3 minutes. And I'll show you also what the rules say, or rules, the guidelines, the rubric says about where that thesis has to be as well. So all of this 10 minutes in, right? I know that sounds crazy that I'm saying do all of this and spend 10 minutes when you only have 40 minutes, but I promise you, I'm going to explain in just a minute. I promise you, taking time to do this, you're going to appreciate it when you're writing it. From there, it's actually writing the LEQ. I say give yourself 25 minutes. Once you have all that other stuff, you know what you need. You just need to actually get it on the paper and just put it out there, right? You are not penalized for like bad writing per se, or like splitting commas and doing things like that. This is not about being perfect. This is about making an argument and supporting it with evidence. You do that quickly. Spend that 25 minutes as much as possible to go ahead and include context. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Include as much evidence as you can. And at the end, you want to include a so what statement. This is that last point. So remember that when I say so what. Include a so what statement for synthesis and complexity. Write for 25 minutes and then kind of review your answer and revise for 5 minutes. And that's a total of 40 minutes. This, I think, works with practice. This is not like when you do this first one, you're going to sit down and you're going to start writing, and you may not be a paragraph in, and it'll already be 40 minutes. And that's okay. But as you practice this and as you do these, you'll get better at the timing. But it's so crucially important because I'm going to show you again, right? You have 40 minutes to do, if this will work, you have 40 minutes to do the long essay question, and you have 60 minutes to do the DBQ. And the DBQ takes a long time. You're going to want those 60 minutes. If you go over here, even though you'll probably do the DBQ first, if you go over here, for instance, right, let's say you end up taking 70 minutes, then you're only end up with 30 to write this anyway, right? If you're on time here and you finish in 60, then you only have 40 minutes to write. You want to make sure that you're using that time. But if you're going to give yourself time anywhere, you want to give it to yourself on the DBQ and not the LEQ. Because again, I think being decent writers, you're going to be able to figure that out. So let's go ahead and look at the scoring guide, and then we'll get into how we go through writing these. And this, again, the reason I'm showing you the scoring guide, when I give these out on paper, I give the scoring guide with it. When you see the prompt, all of this information is right at the top. The College Board is very clear about what you need to do going in. It's not a surprise. It's not a secret. It's very clear what you're supposed to be doing. The rubric is very objective, meaning that it's a checklist, right? You either do it or you don't. And so that's pretty straightforward here. So I'm just going to show you this kind of quickly and go through it. Your thesis is the first point, part A of this rubric. And you can see it says respond to the prompt with a historically defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Right? When it says historically defensible claim, what it means is that as a historian, someone could look at your argument and they could agree based on the evidence they have, or they could disagree. Doesn't mean you're wrong, but they could have a different take on it, right? Having a statement that is just true is not historically defensible. It's just a fact, right? It's not a historically defensible claim, right? Likewise, of course, having a statement that's false, it's not historically defensible because it's not defensible. So, for instance, if you were writing about the Titanic, I don't see that happening, but if you were writing about the Titanic and you said in 1912 the Titanic sank and more than 1,000 people died, I think that's correct, right? That's just a fact, right? There's nothing defensible about that. If you said in 1912 regulations, or difference in regulations between Great Britain and the United States led to the sinking of the Titanic, or the tragedy of people dying, I guess it wouldn't have led to the sinking, right? Then that is a historically defensible claim. I could look at it and say, well, it wasn't the regulation that caused it. It was the actions of the people on the ship. There's all sorts of things you could say that caused that to be a tragedy, right? That particular aspect of your argument is really important. It has to be historically defensible. That also means you can't take the middle ground, right? You can't say, if it says the extent to which the sinking of Titanic was caused by regulations, you can't say, well, in some ways it was caused by regulation and in some ways it wasn't. No, you need to have an answer. It either was or it wasn't. You don't have to necessarily believe it, right? You just need to be able to defend it and make that argument. Context should be one of the easiest points in the rubric, but it's not. It's one of the least gotten points, and it's because students often just forget to try this point. Think about when you're writing any essay and you start introducing your topic, right? You always lead in with a story, a build-up. We sometimes call them hooks, something attention grabber. In this case, your hook can just be what was happening right before this, right? If you were talking about the Titanic, I'll just keep using that example, and you were to say, well, prior to 1912, ships were built like this and they were used for this purpose and all this stuff was happening, right? You're telling me all the stuff, and then you say, in 1912, the sinking of the Titanic was caused by regulation, whatever, right? The fact that you are showing me what happened before this is the lead up to it. That's context, right? It can be things that happen right after. It can be things that are going on at the same time. So, for instance, with 1912, you could say something like just prior to that, all of this was right before World War I. If you were trying to like set like that idea, I don't really like that one because that's kind of complicated. If you're trying to give the broader context. But you just say what happened right before it. It can't be a single sentence. It can't be a phrase or reference. The full rubric says this. It's in files on Canvas if you want to see the full rubric. But it's not going to be, and I want to make sure that you're clear about this. It is going to be something that happened, again, just before it. Just tell us what happened right before it. You can make it a whole paragraph. It's as long as your thesis is in the first paragraph, which I didn't say that up here. Your thesis has to be in the first paragraph. It's either in the first paragraph or the last paragraph. If you say it somewhere in the middle, I can't take it. There are no points there. It doesn't matter if it's the best thesis in the world. It has to be in the opening paragraph or the closing paragraph. You can put your context also in the opening paragraph, or you could just start with your thesis and then go into your context in another paragraph. However you want to do that. So broader historical context relevant to the prompt. Argument development using evidence. Let's look at this closely, right? Both of these say something that I want to make sure you're recognizing. Provides specific examples. You'll notice that is plural. My pen didn't really work there. You'll notice that that's plural. So provides specific examples, right? That means there has to be two or more. If you just have one, you don't get this point. To the topic of the prompt. This just means you mentioned them, right? You provided them, you threw them in, they're there, right? You just mentioned it. That's fine. To get 2 points, and that's what you should be shooting for, then that evidence that you use needs to support that argument. Let's go back to Titanic. Let's say you're talking about, I don't know, the unsinkable Molly Brown, right? That's specific evidence. She was on the Titanic, I think, and that's, I'm pretty sure. And that's specific evidence. Just mentioning it gets you 1 point if you do that twice, right? Just mentioning those types of evidence gets you 1 point. But if you said the fact that unsinkable Molly Brown was on the ship and she was so well known made it so that this was, or proves that this was a significant event because blah, 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 right? That is using it to support your argument that you're talking about, right? So you want to, in some way, support your argument. The way you do that is like when you're writing, just like you normally would in a paragraph, you say, I believe this, because this, and here's my evidence to support it, right? Some people use ACE. I'm going to put it out here. ACE as an acronym, which is answer, cite, that's your evidence, and then explain how your evidence supports. So ACE works too. ACE, answer, cite, explain. Whatever you need to do, but it has to be two pieces of specific evidence. Also, specific, right? If you said the Titanic is a ship, right, that doesn't work. That's not specific evidence. If you said it was sailing in the ocean, that's true. That's a fact, right? But it's not specific. It needs to be the Atlantic Ocean, right? If you said it's sailing to Europe, not really specific. You said it's sailing to Great Britain, I think that's right, or from, either way. That's specific. When I try to tell students to use things that are proper nouns, right? Would you have to capitalize it? That means it's probably specific. People, places, developments, big ideas. Most of those key terms that I give you would work. Some of them wouldn't because some of them are not like specific. But for the most part, the key terms that you have would work. So think key terms here. All right, and then these last 2 points on the LEQ, are this one especially is different than on the DBQ. It says you're using historical reasoning. All of them are based on one of these 3 things here: comparison, causation, or change in continuity over time. Comparison means that you're saying how is something similar and how is something different. Causation means what was the cause of this or what was the effect of this. Change in continuity over time is what changed or what stayed the same over time, right? It's going to ask you one of those. It's going to ask you what were the similarities between this and this, or what were the differences between this or this. It's going to say, how did this thing cause this thing, or how did this thing affect this thing, right? It's not going to do both. You get a point here if you are using this to frame your entire argument. Again, let's go back and say you're doing, you put your thesis, then in your body paragraph, you say that, again, regulation caused the sinking of the Titanic because here's my evidence and this is how I'm proving my thesis. And then you go to the next paragraph, you say this is my next piece of evidence and this is how it's proving my thesis, right? You're continually using that. And then you're going to come back at the end and you're going to say, this is, what I said. This was my evidence. This is how I proved it. This is why I think this is true, right? So you're just continually going back. I call this a good writing point, and it's hard for me to write like full words here. So I'm just going to put GW, good writing point, because it's just doing the right thing by writing. And so as long as you're kind of framing it with that, then you're going to get that point. It can be hard to get because a lot of times students, because they don't pre-write, they don't prep, they'll just kind of lose the plot a little bit in the middle. And then this last point is that so what point I was telling you about. It's very difficult, but I'm going to tell you the things I think you can do. This one here is what I was just talking about a minute ago, where I said it's only going to ask you one. If it only asks you about what the cause of the Titanic was, and you say, but here's the effect, and you go into detail on that, not a phrase or a reference, right? But you're actually explaining it, what the effect was. Like regulation was changing and this happened, and now the next time this occurred, right? You're explaining that, then you're doing this one here where it says explaining both causes and effects, right? If it asks you the similarities and you give me a paragraph on differences as well, right, then you're doing explaining both similarity and difference, right? So that's a good one to do. And then this one is the other one I think is relatively easy to get. We call this the unicorn point because it can be difficult. Explaining relevant and insightful connections within and across periods. That's the so what thing. Give me a paragraph at the end. Why does this matter? Why is it significant in history? You're saying, well, this happened, and because of that, all of these things were affecting. And give me specific examples, right? The Titanic occurred. Well, now, in 1920, some other ship was happening or some other regulations were occurring, and this thing didn't happen because those regulations occurred or whatever, right? You're giving me an insightful connection somewhere else, preferably outside of the years that it gives you, right? We'll look at that in just a second. So these things are an either or. It's either or that. So if you don't do this, but you do this, you get 2 points. If you only do this, you get 1 point. If you do this one and not that one, whatever, you get 2 points. It's an either or. Okay. All right, so for the sake of time, let's go ahead and look at the question real quick. I don't know how long I actually have left because I'm trying to keep this under 30 minutes. But I'm just going to kind of run through this really quickly, and then you'll see some examples. It won't be this one, unfortunately, but you'll see some examples, and you can look at those types of things. But this is what it's going to look like. It's going to say suggested writing time. This would be question 2. This would be question 2. There'd be a 3. There'd be a 4. And you would get to choose which one you're going to do, either question 2 or 3 or 4. You get 40 minutes, as it says. Again, it all goes together, so you're choosing your time. And it tells you what to do. Respond with that historically defensible thesis, context, argument, response to prompt using specific example, historical reasoning, or it should say use evidence to corroborate, qualify, modify the argument, right? That's so what. So it's telling you what to do right there. It lays it all out. So I'm looking at this and it says evaluate the extent to which religion shaped political ideas in British North America from 1730 to 1783. Now remember what I said I think you should do, right? I'm saying you want to first read the question and break down what it says, right? Evaluate the extent to which religion shaped political ideas in British North America from 1730 to 1783, right? So I'm looking at this and I say, evaluate the extent to which religion shaped. Another way you could say this is changed, shaped, or changed, political ideas where British North America, this is very significant because the period is talking about it. You can't talk about places like Florida. You obviously can't talk about Britain because you're talking about British North America. So where and when, 1730 to 1783. All right, so again, once I know what it's asking me to do, I'm talking about change and continuity over time. Right up here, continuity and change. I'm looking at change over time. How did, and not how did it change? I should also point that out. It's not saying how did it change it. It's saying the extent to which it changed it, right? How much did it change it, right? It's actually saying it did. So if you come in with a thesis that says religion shaped political ideas in British North America from 1730 to 1783, it's like, yeah, we know, right? That's just restating the prompt. So you can't do that. If you say it's religion shaped political ideas to a large extent in British North America from 1730 to 1783, that's an answer to the question. And what I would do is go ahead and say like how, right? It changed it to a large extent through this, this, and this, or through this and this, however many reasons you're going to have, right? But remember, I just know that now. I'm not really trying to get to a thesis yet. My next thing is going to be evidence. Right, I'm not going to go through the whole thing of finding evidence. I'm just going to show you some examples. Sorry, let me get down here. I went too far. So here's some examples of evidence. I can go further. Some of these things you should be familiar with. Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, evangelical churches like Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians. For instance, this is not specific, but this is. So that's a good example. If you said evangelical churches were forming, that's not specific. But if you said Baptist churches were forming, that would be specific. If you said there was a religious awakening, probably wouldn't give that to you. But if you said it's the Great Awakening, I would. Hopefully you see the difference in that. I'm going to see if there's some more examples down here. I think there are. Yes, evidence. Here we go. So here they all are. Anglicanism, anti-popery, which is against Catholicism, Calvinism, Catholicism, praying Indians, Congregationalism, deism, dissenters, Jonathan Edwards, established state religion, new and old light, so on and so forth, Quakerism, all of that. So all of these are examples of things that we might see. Again, saying religious is not good. Saying Shakers is. Saying preachers, not good. Saying George Whitefield works. Right, talking about people, deist is fine. You can say deist, and you can say Benjamin Franklin. That's okay as well. But you can't say the founding fathers didn't agree with this. Right, that doesn't work. So you want to be specific. So I said do that. I said find that evidence and then come up with your thesis. Right. So let's look at some. Sorry, I know I'm going back and forth. I hope it's not too changing. I just did not split the pages up very well. So here's some examples of acceptable theses, and I'm just going to double check. I don't know if it's going to take you off the screen and see if it will. Let me keep going. I think we're good. So if you're looking at examples of acceptable theses, the most significant way that religion shaped political ideas in British North America was the influence of the First Great Awakening on the coming of the American Revolution. So this is saying how it did it, and that works in this case without saying the extent fully, because it's saying like that it is, let's see, sorry, the influence of the First Great Awakening on this coming American Revolution. The extent was it was so much change that it had this big impact on the American Revolution. Right. So in that case, you haven't exactly said it's a large, massive extent, but you're still answering the question by saying the extent was it completely changed America, right? British North America. Another one says American political ideas were greatly affected by religion in this period because the idea that all people had rights. So it's saying it's it's saying greatly affected. It's saying a big change because the idea that all people had rights contributed to the American Revolution. Right. So again, it's giving me a little bit of a why. It's giving me some of that particular like answer there as well. But I've got greatly affected. It keeps happening. Sorry. Greatly affected. Maybe not. My pen stopped working. There it goes. Greatly affected is there. And then where it says examples of unacceptable theses, religion shaped political ideas in British North America in the 18th century in many ways. Like, again, we know, like that's what the question said. So you want to not restate the prompt. You want to tell me more than that. The most significant way that religion shaped American political ideas was the American Revolution. Okay. It says here that it does not suggest a line of reasoning, like how. So whereas this one tells us how, the other one does not, right? So that's in general how that's going to work in terms of the thesis. You want to have a specific example. You want to kind of explain what's going on. You want to give some of that particular thing, like what's going on before. Sorry, I'm rushing to get that time in. Then the next thing you're looking at is context, things that happen right before. Look at it talking about transatlantic commerce. That's something that's going on in this time period. The continued growth of slavery is an ongoing thing. So that's one of those things that's like at the same time as this religious thing that's happening, people are also dealing with like slavery, especially if you're talking about Quakers or something. That would be something you could talk about. Conflicts with Native Americans and British colonists, that's happening at the same time. The Enlightenment happened before and led to the Great Awakening because people were thinking for themselves about science and reading and all these different things. And then they started thinking, oh, well, religion, I can think for myself too. I don't need like the Catholic way or whatever. So that's another thing you could look at. The 7 Years' War is going on at the same time. You could talk about some of those things, right? And then you could do after and talk about the American Revolution. But this context, again, it's not a phrase or reference. I think it probably says that. It can be from before, during, or after the period as long as the response accurately and explicitly connects the context to how religion shaped political ideas. Is not awarded for merely a phrase or reference, right? So make sure that you're explaining that. Okay. And then finally, we'll just go down and look at complexity. This doesn't give us any like written examples, but it just tells us what you can do. And talk. Oh, sorry, I didn't keep going. And so here's some examples. You could get this extra point here by arguing that while evangelical religious ideas contributed to the Patriot movement, religious ideas were also used by those colonists who sought to support existing colonial authority. So you could say like, well, while that changed or while this did affect that, it really didn't affect it in this way, or it changed this thing, but it didn't do that. You could say, although religious ideas contribute to the American Revolution, the Whig leaders who declared independence from Great Britain were more influenced by mostly secular ideas. So you could say it had a big impact, but not as an impact as these secular ideas about natural rights from Enlightenment, right? That's another thing where you could disagree and maybe add that. Again, you can't get it just for this phrase or reference. You have to talk about it and explain it a little bit. You could argue that while the settlement patterns of the British colonies encouraged the acceptance of religious diversity and toleration, imperial conflicts with Spain and France in the 18th century also encouraged colonists to embrace. So it wasn't a strictly British thing, right? So hopefully you're seeing in this case, it's really just taking the prompt and going further, saying, so what? Like, what's the importance? Why does this matter? Or in some cases, arguing with the prompt. You can modify, where it says support, modify, refute kind of thing. You can modify and say, well, I understand that this is a big important thing, and I've just explained that to you. But also, this is important, or it's more important. And so that's sort of the idea with the LEQ. This point is to show that you have some historical thinking beyond just what they gave you. And you can do that in the DBQ as well. Is the end of this video. I just wanted to make sure that you had a full understanding of what the LEQ is. It's an important aspect, but it's not something that I want you to stress too much about because, again, you've been writing essays all your school career, and I think it's something that you can do. You do want to focus on what is in the rubric, making sure that you're following along with that, making sure that you're using good, specific evidence to back up strong, solid, historically defensible arguments. If you have any questions about this, please reach out before you write your Period 3 LEQ. Otherwise, give yourself some time, go ahead and look at it. Sit yourself down, give yourself that true time, see if you can do it in that 40-minute time limit, and then still get your best attempt at this particular LEQ. But I want you to make sure that you're understanding, do you need more time? Do you need less time? More practice, less practice, so on and so forth. Again, if you have questions, let me know. Hope you have a wonderful day. Look forward to seeing your work on this LEQ. Have a great one.